Over the past decade, investors have poured capital into Southeast Asia. Vietnam, in particular, has benefited.
They export a lot of final assembly of electronics, like some of your iPhones or your Samsung smartphones. They also export a lot of apparel.
President Trump's tariff plan could shake up this trade.
Vietnam is highly vulnerable.
Leaders around the world have asked the White House to back down from the tax hikes. In response, President Trump lowered tariff rates to 10% on most countries, except China.
I also have to say, 90-day pauses are not an eradication of tariff risk.
The tax hikes on products across Southeast Asia could be potent. U.S. imports of Vietnamese products grew rapidly in recent years. Experts say this may be connected to foul play from China.
Our analysis points to some tentative evidence of rerouting, particularly by Chinese firms that newly invested in Vietnam after 2018. If this can be definitively shown, countervailing measures against those particular exporters may be warranted.
What could these developments mean for producers in Vietnam and their customers in the United States?
Wow, so I didn't know that was happening. So China is diverting a lot of their kind of final assemblies and a whole bunch of other products to Vietnam, and then Vietnam sends it over to the US. So of course, with the tariffs that Trump is imposing right now, as of today, it is still on a 90-day pause. With China having such high tariffs, they have to find ways to kind of cut costs. And sounds like with sending a lot of the items to Vietnam for final assembly and then sending it to the United States for sale, it is still cheaper than just having China send products directly to the US with those tariffs. So let's see what they're doing here.
Factories in Vietnam produce many consumer goods sold in the US.
So Vietnam has become a second largest supplier of clothing and shoes to the US after China. So major of American brands source heavily from Vietnam. For example, Nike, they produce about 50% of its footwear and 28% of its apparel in Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
Manufacturers in Vietnam produce furniture for companies like Wayfair and toys for companies like Hasbro and Mattel.
Wow, so 50% of Nike shoes are made in Vietnam. That's substantial.
Companies like Apple and Samsung also rely on Vietnam's manufacturing.
You know, Samsung alone employ 160,000 workers in Vietnam.
Between 2018 and today, more and more companies started actually investing anew in Vietnam. So Apple coordinated with a lot of its Taiwanese suppliers to move more production into Vietnam.
Businesses with supply chains that run through Vietnam saw their stocks sink as news of higher import taxes spread. If tariff rates proposed in April go into effect, they could cost around $3,800 for the average U.S. household. The U.S. has a much higher level of gross domestic product per capita when compared to Vietnam's.
There is simply a lot more demand in the United States for the kinds of things that Vietnam exports than there is demand in Vietnam for what the United States exports.
Wow, so that's kind of interesting, right? So things that are made in Vietnam, there's much more demand for it to be sent to the United States. The American people want products that Vietnam makes, more so than what the Vietnamese people want.
And that's a function of the fact that the two economies are at very, very different levels of development. So the United States is an advanced economy. We tend to export goods that are capital intensive. Vietnam is a relatively poor country where demand for things like the new 787 is going to be much more limited.
The White House says that higher tariff rates will help the U.S. compete with rising powers like China. In recent years, businesses have reduced their production in China and ramped up in other developing countries, like Vietnam. This is known as the China Plus One strategy.
The way production works these days, pieces of a product come from all over the world and then are assembled together. But over the years, China had become the factory for the world. And so a lot of supply chains were entirely located inside China. So for example, an Apple iPhone, all the components would be produced and then finally assembled in China. But that became risky. And it became risky as Chinese wages started to go up, as people had concerns about too much dependence on a particular country. And so the insurance strategy was to open a factory in another country, say, for example, Vietnam or Thailand or Bangladesh or India,
One of the reasons that Vietnam has been on the come up, so to speak, has been because China has been so successful in its development model that it is pricing itself out of things like making t-shirts or sewing shoes and that kind of thing. They've moved on into kind of higher value added products.
China has been accused of using Vietnam to pass through some exports into the US. This tactic could help China avoid Trump's 2018 tariffs.
So that makes sense to what they were saying earlier, that China pretty much controlled the whole entire supply chain of a product, right? And just like your investments, you do not want all your eggs in one basket. In this example, China. So just like you don't want all your stock in Tesla, you don't want all your stocks in just one company, because that is extremely volatile and it opens you up to so much risk. That's why everybody always says to diversify your portfolio. Companies are doing the same thing here. They're kind of moving away from China a little bit, and building factories and warehouses in other countries to kind of diversify their supply chain.
Saw a massive increase happening as a result of those 2018 tariffs. So one type of activity was what we like to call value-added production. So they were importing raw materials and intermediate products from China into a country like Vietnam or Thailand, and then doing the production in Vietnam and exporting. That was the vast majority of the activity, about 84% of the activity. But there's a smaller part, maybe 16%, depending how you measure it, which is rerouting, essentially relabeling products. So saying this is a product that was originally made in China, no new value-added activity took place in Vietnam, and then it was exported as a Vietnamese product.
So it's very interesting what he just said. I heard of stories of China pretty much making your Louis Vuitton, your Gucci, or whatever luxury item you're thinking about, and shipping the final product back to the country of origin in Europe. And they do the final assembly just by putting in the Gucci tag or the Louis Vuitton tag. Kind of similar to what's going on here, Everything was made in China, and then they ship it to Vietnam, and then Vietnam can put that final assembly in there saying it was made in Vietnam, so they can avoid these tariffs.
Economists say the higher tariff rates under discussion reflect trade deficits between the US and other nations.
The relationship between the United States and Vietnam, the trade deficit is relatively sizable. It has grown in the last year to be about $123.5 billion.
The US under Trump says that many countries are using unfair trade tactics like currency manipulation to expand their trade surpluses.
One of the things that the Vietnamese are considering is essentially revaluing their currency in response to the tariffs. Because if the tariffs are going to raise prices of Vietnamese producers so much that a decline in the currency is maybe the only option they have to compensate unless they can reach a settlement with the US government.
However, it's already low in 2024 already.
In April, a delegation from Vietnam reached out to the White House to strike a deal.
We've already seen Vietnamese Party General Secretary contact the U.S. administration, offering to potentially go down to zero tariffs on U.S. products entering Vietnam. The primary driver of this bilateral trade deficit that the United States has with Vietnam is not driven by tariffs or protectionism on Vietnam's part. It's driven by the fact that there's just relatively much more demand in the United States for Vietnamese products than there is demand in Vietnam for U.S. products.
Very true.
As tariff rates are negotiated, countries like Vietnam are bracing for impact.
People have called it like an unforced error or a self-inflicted wound, but it's worse than that because it's essentially like a suicide pact that's taking out large other countries along with the U.S. economy.
The White House did not respond to CNBC's request to participate in this story. In the year 2000, the U.S. and Vietnam signed a trade agreement which took tariff rates down from around 40% to 3%. Today, exports to the United States from Vietnam account for 30% of Vietnam's gross domestic product.
The outlook for the people of Vietnam, who, if we know anything about history in the last 50 years, have really been through the ringer, much of it at the hands of the United States, the outlook was very positive. Once you graduate into that lower middle income status and your manufacturing sector is taking off, this is a period in which that economic growth is translating into real household gains. so that the dirt floor becomes a cement or tile floor. The electricity is on 24 hours a day as opposed to maybe 8 or 12. That is a really heartbreaking point in economic development for the people of Vietnam to be looking at potentially taking a big step back from their first real taste of the kind of affluence that we in the West, in the United States in particular, often take for granted.
Wow, so that's very interesting. In the recent past decade, I've kind of noticed that there's been a lot more of my products made in Vietnam versus made in China. And this is probably one of the reasons why. Are you also noticing a bunch of your products are actually made in Vietnam nowadays? Let me know in the comments. I got a lot of clothes that are now made in Vietnam. And again, it was very surprising to me, because I went to Vietnam a long time ago. I didn't see a single factory. I didn't know what was going on. And all of a sudden, everything's popping up that it was made in Vietnam. But of course, this piece by CNBC kind of tells you exactly why. A lot of companies are investing in Vietnam. China is putting a lot of things into Vietnam as well. All that to kind of avoid these high tariffs that could be imposed by the Trump administration. But anyways, thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you guys in the next video.